Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final PowerPoint of the year. This one is for Unit 5, Political Participation. So when we talk about political participation, the most important way, and probably the easiest way for most people to get involved, is through voting. But voting isn't something that all Americans had, even still have, and it's changed throughout time through two different ways, through legislation and the Constitution. So originally, when the Constitution was first written, voting was pretty much restricted to rich white people. You had to be each state had dealt with things differently. States always have the right to decide their own voting policies, so that's one important piece of this. When we talk about like all of these amendments in this legislation, it's important to recognize that certain states had done this far before anybody else. This is just making it like a standard for the national level. So, for example, the 15th Amendment says you cannot discriminate for voting based on race. But at that time, it's not like no black people in America could vote. Some states did allow that, just like some states allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment. But these were the ones that made it, official for the entire country. They had to follow this. So 15th Amendment is about race, like I already mentioned, and we've talked about before. The 17th Amendment allows for senators to be elected by the people because originally, if you'll remember from the beginning of the class, in the Constitution, the Senate was a group that was picked by state representatives, so they weren't directly picked by the people. And because the president was also chosen by electoral college, the only group that's actually, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, directly chosen by the people is the House. Everything else selected by somebody else. So 17th Amendment kind of just changes that. Senators are now elected by the people. 19th Amendment gives the right to vote to women. 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes. So we talked about that in the last unit. Poll taxes were a requirement that, especially immediately following the Civil War, were pretty distinctly racist because a lot of, especially in the South, a lot of African Americans could not pay a poll tax because they were sharecropping. Um, Freed slaves, particularly, were damaged by that. So the 24th Amendment, they make it official that nobody should have to pay anything to vote, that voting is a right and not a privilege, and you don't have to pay for it at all. This amendment is coming up again now a little bit because of the debate on national or polling IDs, voter IDs, because some people argue that originally when these voter ID laws came up, which were on the surface to prevent voter fraud, to make sure that you are who you say you are when you're voting. But if it requires some sort of ID, like a driver's license, you have to pay for a driver's license. So if you have to pay for an ID that can prove your identity, then does that violate the 24th Amendment? Or what most states have done to get around that is they say you can either show an ID like that, like a driver's license, or if you don't have anything like that, they'll provide you with a free voter ID card and you can use that. So that's kind of the way they've gotten around that, but that was in the discussion because of the 24th Amendment. 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18, so people could vote, when they're 18. And you can see down there at the bottom left that button. The main reason for this, impetus for this amendment, was that at 18 you were able to fight in the military and go to a foreign nation and fight and die for the country, but you couldn't vote on leaders that were sending you to do that. So that seemed like a pretty big problem, and then that's why the 26th Amendment gets passed, and that was kind of the main impetus of it. For the legislative side, you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we've talked about before in this class, and it did things like eliminate literacy tests. It made up policy where the federal government could monitor the elections of states that were, historically disenfranchising people to make sure that they weren't doing things that were going to continue to disenfranchise people. That has stopped recently. The federal government kind of stopped enforcing that part of the law, but that's what it was because they, even though states get to choose their own voting policies, a bunch of states had made it clear that they can't be trusted to do that because every time they were given any leeway at all, they went and, disenfranchised people, like through poll taxes and literacy tests. And they always look for ways to get around that. So that's what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does. It also allows the federal government to register voters, so that they could skip this whole racist state process and go straight through the federal government. So that's the legislative aspect of it. So there's two main avenues that they expanded voting rights through: the Constitution and the legislation. So when people do vote, there are different models of voting behavior that they could follow and different ways that they could choose the candidates that they are voting for. So I'll just kind of go through the main ones here. The first one, rational choice voting. And this is voting based on, what is perceived to be rational for that person's individual interest. So, for example, economic policy. Like maybe you want to vote for candidates or parties that will benefit you financially. So if you are like super rich, you might not be voting for like Bernie Sanders, who wants to tax you at a really high level. You're more likely to vote for somebody that maybe favors trickle down economics, where you can retain a lot of your wealth. Retrospective voting is voting based on what somebody has, whether somebody should be reelected based on the recent past. So, in 2012, if you're voting with a retrospective voting behavior, you're going to be voting based on what you think Obama had done in office for the first 4 years. Do you agree with it, disagree with it? Do you think they should be reelected based on that? So there you're kind of looking more to the past to see, whether or not to vote for this person. Prospective voting is kind of the opposite of that. It's a prediction of how it's going to perform in the future. You're going to vote for a candidate because maybe think that their policies will work, that they are going to be helpful in the future. Now, this maybe is more useful in an election like in 2016, where there is no incumbent to look retrospectively at. So you need to kind of look forward and see like who you think is going to be better in the future based on their policies. And then there's also party line voting, which is basically just voting for a candidate because they're a member of a particular party. And when you're talking about party line voting, you're often just going down the ballot. Like down ballot voting means that you're voting for all of one party. So you just click down the line for Republican and Democrat, and that would be party line. And for that, for a lot of people voting based on the party, it doesn't even really matter what the policies are. They probably don't even really know all of the policies about every single thing, because they're just trusting that it's generally going to be aligned with what they believe, because they're a member of this party and they have similar values, and that's really the most important metric, not any of the actual policies that this person has. So voter turnout refers to how often or how many people go out and actually vote. And voter turnout in America is traditionally pretty low, especially when there's not a president on the ballot. And there are various factors that impact what voter turnout is going to be. So the first one is demographics, and that's probably the biggest one. You can usually predict what voter turnout will be roughly just based on a particular area's demographics, their education, their age, their race. This can usually be predictive. Age is a really big one, maybe the biggest one, because you can clearly see the voting trends between young people and older people. The 18 to 25 age group just doesn't vote very often. They just don't turn out in very large numbers, whereas older people tend to vote a lot more. There's a variety of potential reasons for that, but at the end of the day, that is a really big factor for voter turnout. So when you see candidates like Barack Obama that are particularly effective in certain states and certain areas, it's because they were able to get the young vote out. They were able to get them to go vote. Same with African American voters. Barack Obama had a very high level of turnout for that group as well, where a lot of times the minorities don't vote as much. So that demographics is one big area that could determine voter impact or voter turnout. Next one is political efficacy and engagement, which basically efficacy means that what people think about the government. Do they trust the government? Do they like the government? Do they think that their vote matters, that they have some impact on policy? And if people think that, if they have a high political efficacy, that means they're much more likely to go out and vote because they think it matters, it has some impact in that. Whereas if they don't trust the government, they don't think that their vote is really doing anything, then they're much less likely to go out and actually vote. So political efficacy and engagement is a big part of that as well. Another factor that impacts voter turnout is state voting laws. Different states have different laws and procedures on where to vote, how to vote, when they could vote. Some states allow for early voting, so they open up the booths early, like sometimes weeks early, so that people can go in and vote during more convenient times. Some states allow for mail-in ballots for everybody, like anybody can mail in a ballot and it's counted. Some states only allow that if you are disabled or maybe you're temporarily out of the state, like you're away at college. A lot of you are going off to college and you'll probably be mailing in absentee ballots when you vote. So that all matters too. Voter IDs matter as well too. Some states have them, some don't. In New Jersey, they can't. The only time they're allowed to ask you for an ID is if you are a first-time voter or you haven't voted in I think it's three elections or something like that. But if you voted 1 year for presidential election and then in the next election you go to vote and they ask you for an ID, they're technically not allowed to do that. They have to, at least not in New Jersey, those are our laws. But in other states, they could require that, and that's usually going to bring turnout down. Even if the ID is free and they can get it for free from the government, it's less likely that people are going to go out and do one more thing to get something to vote. So that'll limit turnout as well. And then midterm versus presidential elections is also a big one. People are much, much less likely to turn out during a midterm election. Midterm meaning that it's just Congress. There's no president on the ticket. When there's a presidential election on the ballot, voter turnout is much, much higher. So that's another big predictor. And this is just a picture that shows what I was just talking about with presidential versus midterm voter turnout. And you can see it's always much, much higher during a presidential election. People are just much more engaged. But you can see that in 2018, voter turnout during this midterm was pretty high, higher than it had been in a very long time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. People's feelings about the current president usually matter a lot. If people are particularly happy with that president or particularly unhappy with that president, you tend to see a lot more turnout because people want to either advance or hinder their agenda. So that's part of it as well. And I think you could probably see that with 2018, just because of how polarized we are. I think you probably got both of those things. But regardless, presidential elections are always much, much higher than midterm elections in terms of turnout. But even in our best years, we're still barely over 60%. So there's really still very low turnout for Americans voting in general. So that was all how to predict whether people are going to vote. This is about now influencing who they vote for, how they choose a candidate. So 4 main ways that people choose who they're going to vote for. First one is probably the most important one, and that's party identification and ideological orientation. So people are just generally going to vote for the party that they are registered for, if they're registered with the party. And that's the number one predictor of how people are going to vote. Registered Democrats, they're going to vote Democrat most of the time. So that's the most important one. Second one is candidate characteristics. Recently, politics has moved towards this candidate-centered election process where it used to be more about the party and policies and stuff like that, but now it's about the candidates themselves. They kind of become the main focus. So, it's a lot more personality based than perhaps it used to be. Whereas policy is less important because now what we care about more is the individuals themselves. We talk more about like Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump and who they are rather than the policies that they represent, although that's certainly part of it. But when we're talking about candidate-centered elections, we're talking more about the characteristics of them, how well they speak, how relatable they are, stuff like that. Metrics that are not really based on policy. Contemporary political issues are also going to be a big factor in that. Some people are going to vote for certain candidates because they're influenced by something that recently happened. So, maybe if there's an election immediately after a mass shooting, then that could be something about gun control is a big deal at that moment. And then people would be maybe more likely to vote based on which candidate they agree with more on that particular issue. So contemporary political issues can sway an election and who people are going to vote for because they just happen to be a hot button issue at that moment. And then demographics is also usually pretty predictive. Religious beliefs and affiliations, gender, race, ethnicity, all these other gender demographic characteristics, they are also usually pretty good predictors of how people are going to vote generally. So, you could look at somebody even without really knowing anything about them or their views, and you can just make at least an educated guess on how they're going to vote based on just their demographics. And a lot of polling and prediction stuff happens because of that. So like when when the media on election day calls California, a second after the polls close in California, they're doing that because they know California is going to vote that way based on a lot of different data, but one of it is just demographics. Like they just know based on historic voting trends and the demographics of the state how they're going to vote. That's another big predictor. So linkage institutions are ways that the public communicates with policymakers, and how they tell them what they want them to do. And the main linkage institutions are political parties, interest groups, elections, and the media. So if people want certain policy passed, if people want, gun control or something like that, they would go to these linkage institutions, and that would be how the message gets across to the politicians. People also can write letters to their congressmen and call and stuff like that. But most of the time, when politicians are saying the people want this kind of legislation, they're mostly talking about the way that these linkage institutions communicate that. So political parties, the platform of the party is typically going to be molded after what the people want. Interest groups are going to lobby for the things that people in those interest groups want. And certain industries and certain individuals can group up for that. So, and interest groups aren't just like representing companies, but it's stuff like the NRA. Like the NRA has a lot of clout, but that's because they have a lot of members and they have a lot of people that are there and arguing for these things. Elections, giving that kind of mandate through the government, like the people elect politicians based on policies that they want. So that's another way. And then the media, and this is kind of a tricky one because the media, kind of shapes public opinion in a lot of ways, or at least the public debate. So, it's part of it is that the media shapes the opinion or the topics of conversation and the way people view issues. But then the other side of that is that people influence the media because the media is going to show things that they're interested in. So, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg situation, but that's how we would connect to the government. So those are linkage institutions, the way that we link the people and what we want with the government and the policymakers who actually then make that happen. So political parties play a really large role in elections, both in terms of like getting candidates and deciding who the candidates are going to be, and also kind of mobilizing people. So here are just kind of five main ways that political parties impact the election process, and kind of how the government works. The first one is mobilization and education of voters. So people tend to be more mobilized and get out to vote, and also know more about the issues because the political parties exist to organize those things. So political parties will organize a lot of voter registration stuff, and they'll also be able to educate people both through like more traditional means like pamphlets and websites and stuff like that. But also, if you're a voter and you don't know everything about every single issue, which you probably don't because there's a lot of different varied policy that you maybe don't even care about that much at that moment. But if you agree with the Democrats on like 90% of your stuff, then you're probably going to agree with them on the other 10 you don't really know about. So it's a way to kind of inform people or at least give them some way to vote about things they don't really know that much about, and make it a little bit simpler for them to learn that. They create party platforms, which again are ways to kind of align the views of the party. And people generally will believe most of the things of that platform. People don't believe necessarily everything that their party believes in. But what the party platform does is kind of just creates this large, wide platform for all. So you could say, for pretty much any candidate that's running, for the most part, this is what they're going to generally believe. This is the party platform. It helps to kind of organize things. They also help to recruit candidates to make sure that good candidates get in place. So one of the big successes for the Democrats in the midterms in 2018 was their ability to recruit useful candidates in places where they normally would not get very good candidates. So like Beto O'Rourke is a good example of that because he's running for this seat in Texas that is a very difficult seat to win, and he didn't win it. But it was more competitive than it had been in a very long time, and a big part of that is because they recruited a good candidate. They got somebody that maybe would not have run if he wasn't recruited by the party to do that. So that's another part of it. The party will convince certain people to run and try to put good candidates in good areas where they think that they could potentially win. They also help to manage the campaign, including but not limited to fundraising and media strategy. The party is an old institution that has been around for a long time, and the people working with it have done a lot of campaigns. So they're able to provide a lot of really useful strategy and help during the campaign process, especially for someone like a first-time candidate that doesn't have a lot of organizational structure yet. The party can manage a lot of that. And then also the committee and party leadership in the legislature impacts elections a lot, because they're the ones that are kind of like outlining the policy. And when you talk about like the committee systems in Congress, a big part of some people's reelection bids is what committees they're on and what work they're able to do. And a lot of that is determined by the party leadership and the structure that's put in place in the legislature. So political parties have a huge impact on the process. Those are just some of the ways. There's a lot of other stuff that they do, but these are the most important ways that they impact the election process. So the political parties change often, not necessarily like the parties themselves, although the parties we've had in America have certainly changed over time. But the way that the political party situation has changed recently, it refers more to how the elections have changed. So one big change is candidate-centered campaigns. Now a lot of these campaigns are centered around the individual themselves and their characteristics that are not policy-centered. And that's changed things a lot because it makes the platform less important. It makes the policies less important. When people are more concerned about, their ability to speak well or their, connectability or relatability or whatever, that takes away from a lot of the policy discussion. And that's a big change that's happened a lot recently, specifically within the last maybe, I don't know, 20 years. Um, People use a different metric when they measure candidates. There's also a smaller role for the party in candidate selection. Now with the modern primary system that we have, which has been in place since the 70s, the party doesn't have as much of a say in who gets to be their candidate. It used to be a lot less democratic. Now you have all these primaries or caucuses, and the people are basically deciding who the candidates are going to be. It used to just be the party decided. So that has been a big change as well to lessen the role of the party. The platforms now are developed to appeal to certain voters because they know that certain voters are going to be key to them winning elections. So for Republicans, evangelical Christians are going to be a big part of that. They're going to center a lot of their policies specifically to that demographic because they know that that is kind of their key base. And if they lose that base, then they're unlikely to win elections in the future. Democrats' key base that they're kind of going to try to appeal to are young voters, which is a tricky one because, like I said before, they don't vote very often. But a lot of their platform is going to be aimed at them because that is a large voting bloc that tends to vote Democrat. Parties also now use communication technologies to reach voters and respond quickly to things in a way that they didn't used to before. So 2008, Obama was really the first. That was really the first election where Twitter came into play in a really substantial way. And social media, I should say, more than just Twitter, was really impactful. And so now you're seeing a lot of the change in the way that parties communicate with people. It used to be a lot of mailing stuff, like physically mailing people things, flyers and stuff like that. But now it's a lot of email blasts and social media posts and using Twitter and Instagram or whatever as a way to organize people, but also as a way to communicate with them because they recognize that it's really, really fast. It's at a very large scale, and it is, a way to reach younger people specifically. So the way that people communicate with elections has changed pretty dramatically. And we're still relatively early on with this. This will probably continue to change over time as these different technologies develop more and also people become a bit more comfortable with them. So political parties will continue to change and elections will continue to change. And you're going to just see these different groups try to adjust for that. And I think you've seen probably in the last several years a pretty large realignment too in the way that the political parties operate in terms of their ideologies. You can see the stuff like the Tea Party and the progressives on the Democrat side, and that has changed a lot of how they operate and who they cater to. And in some ways, these parties are now starting to cater to people that are not necessarily the majority of their group, but they are the people that are more engaged in voting more often. So, for Republicans, members of like the Tea Party caucus, that group, people that support their views is a relatively small part of America, but they vote in very large numbers. And in some ways, that makes them a lot more valuable at least for the primary system, than like a moderate who doesn't vote at a very large level. So parties change, elections change. They're going to continue to change over time. We just happen to be kind of in the crux of the big one right now. So in addition to some of the changes that I just talked about, the structure of the party has changed a lot too, of the parties. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One is critical elections and regional realignments. There are times throughout our history where the parties have kind of switched around, and certain people in certain states have just gone with different parties. And I'm now talking about the swing states that kind of go back and forth, but like large permanent changes. So like the South used to be primarily Democrat, and now it is primarily Republican. So that's what I mean by like a regional realignment. And gerrymandering has also impacted that. The ability of states to basically control the state house through gerrymandering has changed things a lot in the way that the parties operate in their structure. And if you look at a state like Wisconsin, that in their last statewide election had something like 60% of the state vote Democrat, and yet their state house is predominantly Republican. Gerrymandering is going to play a pretty large role in how the parties are structured at the state level and the national level. Campaign finance law has changed things too in the way that they organize themselves. Citizens United and McCain-Feingold would be the two big examples of that. And I'm going to talk more about them later on in the PowerPoint, but you already know what Citizens United is. It's changed the way that parties deal with finances for elections because now there's this whole another element of 501c4s and PACs and super PACs and stuff. So the monies in elections have changed a lot. And changing communication and data management technology has changed as well. You're not just using like old school Rolodexes to contact people. Now we have the internet and social media, and the way that we communicate is a lot different, which is big for parties and elections because communicating with people is such a big part of it, and trying to coordinate people and vote and get people to vote certain ways, and that all happens through data management and communications, and that's changed dramatically because of the internet, and it will continue to change as we figure out more about how this is going to work. So third-party candidates struggle pretty mightily in pretty much every election, and the reason for that is because, well, there are several. In winner-take-all elections, it's very difficult for third-party candidates to really gain any traction because the political parties, the two main ones, are just so deeply entrenched already. It's very difficult for them to get a hold of any kind of voters or significant amount of voters. And like in a presidential election, it's impossible basically. In a parliamentary system, a third party can be more successful because they get a percentage of the seats. But because you need to get a majority of the votes, or at least a plurality for most elections of the votes, it's just very unlikely that they're ever going to do that because their agendas are often absorbed by the major parties. So if you're like running for the Green Party, the Democratic Party is going to encompass most of those ideas. So you don't really have a platform that's going to be unique to that. Same with the Libertarian Party and the Republicans. It's just a more extreme version of that. So that's a big part of it. Also, the major parties control the state voting regulations because states control their own voting regulations, and the political parties control the states because they're run by people that are members of these parties. So they can make it really difficult for them to even get on the ballot. So a lot of states have requirements that they can't meet. Like polling numbers or certain number of signatures on petitions. There's different ways that states do it, but because it's all controlled by the parties, it's sometimes difficult for them to break in and be a part of the actual election. So we've talked about interest groups already this year, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining what they are, but I want to talk about the benefits and potential issues with them, specifically as it relates to political participation, because that's what this is all about. So one of the benefits of interest groups is that they're going to be representing a group of people that otherwise wouldn't have a very large voice in politics. So if you take like, the NRA and gun owners, people that own guns separately are not going to be a huge, I mean, it's a big part of the electorate, but it's not necessarily going to be something that, without some organizational mechanism that they can have any real influence. So what that does then is it provides them with the ability to have a larger voice at on the national level that allows them to have more influence, maybe influence that's more reflective of the actual numbers that they possess. Another one could be like a small business lobbying group, and that will take those issues that they have that normally wouldn't really be a very loud voice because they're just a bunch of small businesses, and makes them unified and they can lobby for the same thing. So that's one of the main reasons that they exist in the first place. They also educate voters and also office holders on that. They're pretty instrumental in devising policy and like writing up different bills because they're the experts on this. And like think like environmental lobbying groups. They're going to be experts on a lot of this environmental science that congressmen and voters aren't really experts on. So they can help to educate people about that. And like a draft legislation, which is what I just said. And they also can mobilize membership to apply pressure on legislators and government agencies to get stuff done. And they could do that in a way that an individual would not be able to. A bunch of people writing letters is one thing, but when the NRA can go to Congress and say, we represent this many people, and we demand this action, that's a much bigger deal than one person, leaving a message that some intern's going to like maybe listen to. That doesn't, I mean, it matters, but not as much as a large special interest group could or lobbying group. Some of the potential issues, the big one is that they just have too much influence over the legislative process and executive process. When you have a group like the NRA that is able to throw around so much money, it's one thing for them to lobby Congress and say, we represent all these people, we want this stuff done. It's a totally different thing to say, if you want to get reelected, I'll give you all of this money, but you need to like vote for legislation we want. Or maybe the better way of thinking of it is that they go out and seek candidates that already have their views. But regardless, this creates a system where these groups have a lot of influence and a lot of power, and a lot of that is because of money and finance, which we'll talk about more later. And also, this stuff is not necessarily in the interest of the majority of people. The stuff that the interest groups are fighting for really do represent whatever group they're representing, a small interest. If you're like a pharmaceutical lobbying group, you're representing pharmaceutical companies, not the people. So that's putting a lot of power and a lot of influence, and the influence they have is really significant. And you're putting that in the hands of not people, but like small groups of people or companies that are interested in a very specific policy or section of policy. And maybe that's not super democratic when you have elections impacted so much by a small group of people.